That's the title of an article in today's Wall Street Journal featuring an interview with trade economist and Dartmouth economics professor Douglas Irwin. Here are some key excerpts. Mr. Trump may be the first openly protectionist president since Hoover, but what Douglas Irwin finds most frustrating about him is that he never really defines what a better trade deal is. His judgment of trade comes down to the trade balance, which he uses as a sort of ledger, as a businessman would, rather than think more broadly about the national economic impact of trade. It is impossible for every country to run a trade surplus, but Trump thinks about trade in these zero-sum terms, about whether there's profits or losses, and he views exports as good and imports as bad. That may be because Mr. Trump comes from the casino industry, the real estate industry, where you either get the project or not. You either win against the house or you lose against the house. He fails to see that in international trade, imbalances aren't an indication that one country is beating another, or that one is winning and the other's losing. Mr. Trump's rhetoric and vocabulary are not the way economists think about trade at all. The U.S. has lost steel jobs, but Mr. Irwin says that's because the domestic industry has become more productive. In 1980, it used to take 10 worker hours to produce a ton of steel. Today, it takes less than 2 worker hours. So even though we're producing the same amount of steel, or even more, we use many fewer workers to produce that steel. That old newsreel image of workers mixing metals next to furnaces is far from today's reality, which consists of 1 or 2 engineers who are adjusting dials in a highly mechanized place. Bringing back those blue-collar jobs is just not in the cards, says Mr. Irwin, who attributes the president's insistence otherwise to nostalgia, reflecting back on American greatness after World War II, and trying to recapture those days. Wilbur Ross had a lot of ties to the steel industry. Even Messrs. Ross and Navarro have never fully articulated their protectionist arguments. Mr. Irwin says, I have the sense that they both have protectionist instincts rather than well-thought-out strategies. Both men seem to pine for yesteryear when the big industries were autos and steel, and there was no foreign competition in sight. They seem very uncomfortable in the irrevocably globalized world of today, in which growth sectors are based on high-tech and intellectual property. Mr. Navarro, he continues, thinks free trade arguments are outmoded, and has a particular animus against China. Mr. Trump would like to see the trade deficit go down and U.S. manufacturing revived. But his macroeconomic policies are almost guaranteed to lead to larger trade deficits, not to a smaller one. Mr. Irwin says, since Mr. Trump took office, the U.S. has cut taxes and raised government spending, so that the fiscal deficit is going up. The trade deficit often shadows the fiscal one, because exports get crowded out when the Federal Reserve tightens credit and the dollar appreciates. We're then going to get capital inflows from abroad. Mr. Irwin says, and the trade deficit is going to go up. So, thinking of trade as a process of reaching these deals, where China agrees to buy more, doesn't add up to a lower trade deficit if you have these big macroeconomic forces moving exactly in the opposite direction. Mr. Irwin predicts that Mr. Trump is going to be very frustrated at the end of the first term. MP, notice the YUGE difference. Economists have well-developed and well-articulated arguments in favor of free trade and against protectionism, based on hundreds of years of developing economic and international trade theory, and a mountain of empirical evidence. The economic theory and evidence against protection are so overwhelming that it's considered settled science among economists, to the point that 100% of 40 top economists in a recent survey disagreed with the statement, imposing new U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum will improve Americans' welfare. See graphic below. On the other hand, protectionists, scarcityists have no such theory, evidence or consensus among experts, and can't even articulate their protectionist arguments, according to trade expert Douglas Irwin. And to the extent that they ever try to articulate their protectionist arguments, protectionists, scarcityists are relying on the theory of mercantilism, which was discredited several centuries ago. The pining for yesteryear by protectionists isn't just for a long ago period when the big industries were autos and steel and there was no foreign competition in sight. It's also a pining for a period more than several hundred years ago when the mercantilist argument they support today was once actually taken seriously, maybe back in the 1700s. Donald Trump, protectionism, tariffs, trade. There are no comments available.